Um, bueno, estamos aquí con Dr. Geoff Kendall. Él es co-founder y CEO de Future Fit Foundation. Y Geoff me llamó mucho la atención porque hizo una presentación con una visión sistémica de lo que es la sustentabilidad, presentando un enfoque con algunos modelos que ya fueron desarrollados, como el de Carl Roberts de Natural Step. Y me gustaría que ustedes conozcan un poco más su iniciativa aquí en Argentina. Hello, Geoff. Nice to meet you, to listen to you in Sustainable Brands Buenos Aires. Where Agenda RC is being media partner. And I was amazed about your presentation because you had a very scientific and systemic approach. Well, you're a doctor, but you're in business. So I like people that join business with a scientific approach.
Yeah.
So could you explain your in a shorter way
what we're doing?
Yeah.
Okay. So business has now for many years tried to take account of and measure its social and environmental impacts as well as its financial performance. But the problem is we've never really had a clear definition of how much is enough.
Okay.
So we know what the break-even point looks like for the financial dimension. We have to make as much money as we spend. But what's the minimum every company needs to do on the environmental and social dimension to ensure that it is not harming our transition to a sustainable future? So that's the question that we started with, and we built the Future Fit Business Benchmark to answer that question.
Okay, and which are the barriers that you found in the meantime? Because we all people that are entrepreneurs in this field are change agents. So which are the most important barriers that you find in which countries?
You mean in terms of people embracing the amount of change necessary?
Yeah.
I think
business.
Well, there are several things. I think the first thing is that particularly for public companies, it's very hard for the CEO to think beyond the next quarter's results because the markets demand this constant financial performance and being better than last quarter and so on. And it takes a very courageous leader to actually push back on that. So people like Ray Anderson of Interface, Paul Polman of Unilever have started pushing back, and that's great. But it's very hard to do. So I think in that respect, one thing we need to also work with the big institutional investors, the people that give money to these companies to help them grow and expand and invest in these companies. And we need to help them understand why this is so important as well. So we spend a lot of our time talking to pension funds as well as companies, because if we can get companies to start embracing this, and we can get investors to start asking about this, then hopefully we can create a snowball effect. So the biggest thing, I think, is getting corporate leadership comfortable with the need to do something that is very long term. It's almost like going to the moon. This is not just like hitting a target quarter after quarter. Within organizations, what we found with some of the companies we're working with is if the leadership really does embrace a clear definition, a clear kind of North Star of where it needs to go, then actually employees become very engaged very quickly. They feel like they're doing good for the world rather than just turning up to make the numbers each month. So I think leadership is critical. When you get the leadership on board, it actually becomes much easier for change agents within organizations to do something about it. When it's smaller companies, of course, it's very different. With smaller companies, what we found is we get a lot of excitement, particularly from social entrepreneurs, because there is so much information out there about all the issues we face. And there's so much guidance from people like Global Reporting Initiative and DGSI and BLab, and so much information is very hard to make sense of. So by distilling it down into just 21 Future Fit goals, it actually enables social enterprises to focus on actually doing stuff rather than just trying to understand what to do.
Mm-hmm.
One of the organizations we're working with is a social enterprise in Norway called Bright Products, who make solar lanterns.
Which is the name, sorry?
Bright Products.
Bright Products, okay.
Yes, they make solar lanterns for sub-Saharan Africa, rural India, for disaster zones around the world. And they are already making a product that is good for the world, but they are also the first social enterprise to commit to becoming future fit, because they want to make sure that they have no negative impacts across their entire value chain. So, and the reason they wanted to use the benchmark was because it defines very clearly exactly what they have to do.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about Gunther Pauli's initiative? Because he's talking about that it's not enough circular economy, it's not enough, that we have to redesign business from the core, from the beginning.
We do. We absolutely do. And I think the work he's doing is fantastic. I think if every business leader in the world was like him, we wouldn't be in the situation that we find ourselves in now.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, they're not. And we have a lot of business leaders who really need to be guided towards a destination. And that's what the benchmark tries to provide. Now, all the benchmark does is tell you what the destination is and how far away you are. You still need to think very innovatively to actually cross the gap.
Yeah.
And that's where, some of the inspiring examples that Gunther Pauli was talking about are great to actually convince the rest of the leaders out there that this stuff is possible.
Okay. And what do you think about the term thrivability that is being discussed a lot by leaders? There are some leaders around the world, corporate leaders like Paul Polman, that are embracing some groups like
the B Corp, movement.
Because leadership is one of the main problems nowadays. The model of leadership, I think, and we need another approach, another mindset, a spiritual mindset, perhaps a conscious mindset about all these initiatives. It's very difficult to convince corporate leaders sometimes about this. I think when they are thinking about the first Q, the second Q, and it's very difficult. But do you think is it possible to drive a change towards a more conscious leadership?
We need that change. And I think there are good examples. You mentioned a couple of people that are doing that. I think that what's interesting about the B Corp movement is it's partly about assessing a company against a questionnaire, but the other part of it is that you have to change your articles of association, your company articles, to say that you are thinking about all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And that's really significant.
Yeah.
Because once you make that change to your corporate structure, it's very hard to go back on that. Mm-hmm. So that's good. But I think companies or people that already get the need to do things differently will become B Corps. You can't make people wake up by forcing them to become a B Corp.
No, of course.
So although I agree we need a cultural shift and a mindset shift, and that's at a systemic level.
Yeah.
We need to start within the system we are now.
How do you begin?
Well, so one of the ways you influence a system is, and there's fantastic work done by people like Donella Meadows on systems theory.
And Banati, awesome. Do you know?
Yeah.
Bella Banati.
So there's some great stuff out there on how you influence the system, and one of the ways you do it is you give the right feedback to people, and you have the right incentives.
Yeah.
And the idea with Future Fit is to define what the metrics should be that businesses can aim towards. Businesses are very good if you tell them, if a business sets its own goal and has metrics to measure progress toward it, it's amazing what companies can achieve. Amazing. It's just that we're not chasing the right things at the moment. So our sense of this is it would be very nice. I hear some people talk about capitalism 2.0.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for me because that kind of implies we're going to throw away the old version and start with a new version. Well, you can't. You have to go from where you are to
Yeah.
where you need to be. You can't just start again. If there was a reset button, we would have pressed it a long time ago.
Yeah.
But there isn't. So what we need to do is try to constructively or creatively disrupt where we are now.
Like we
and work
the,
with the
hack,
markets.
to hack
Yeah,
it.
exactly,
Okay.
to hack it. So
Yeah.
if we can start to get companies, as well as financial performance, to start also focusing on what is this break-even point for environmental and social dimensions, then we can work within the current system. I used to work with Sustainability, which is a think tank and consultancy in London.
I know.
And we worked with lots of global companies, and we found that, and this is what got me started on the benchmark, because I found that a lot of the CEOs we were working with really did want to make a difference. But whenever they were looking around for an independent way to measure their progress, they were finding sustainability ratings, things like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And the intention of those ratings is very good to drive progress.
Yeah.
The problem is, because they don't take a systems view of business value, they just focus on best practice instead of required practice.
Yeah.
So you end up with CEOs who really do want to do things differently, who's suddenly chasing a 2% increase in their DJSI score because they think that's making them more sustainable. The reality is all they're doing is getting slightly better than their peers. So the idea of having environmental and social metrics and of CEOs wanting to improve on those metrics, that's already there. It's just the metrics that we're currently using are wrong.
Yeah. And what do you think about, because you mentioned the triple bottom line today, but they're in the United States, they're talking about the quadruple bottom line, which implies psychological issues, cultural issues, because sustainability needs a cultural change. We are talking about cultural change that are embedded in systemic change. So what do you think about this quadruple bottom line models?
I think it's again, it's one of those things where I think that's ideally where we need to go. It's like this idea of gross happiness rather than gross domestic product. These kind of concepts are really interesting concepts. The challenge I have is seeing how we can transition from where we are now to that point. And I think we need to clearly define the line in the sand that we need to reach, but we need to do it in a way that companies and investors know how to engage with. And anything around trying to measure the conscious contribution of business or its contribution to happiness gets really difficult really quickly. So we started with the system conditions defined by the natural step, which have been refined. They originally developed 28 years ago, and they've been refined continuously since. And in the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of work has gone into improving the social system conditions to understand exactly what it is that people and organizations can do to undermine our social fabric and trust and resilience in the system. So it's not exactly going in the direction of measuring happiness, but it is looking at all the ways in which we can undermine people's ability to have a voice, to make meaning in their lives, and so on.
Yes, because you have to motivate people, because
absolutely
things have to be managed in the organization. You have to.
They do, but a lot of it, I think, if you give people the right incentives and you empower them to do things differently. Yeah, I mean, so there's one company we've been working with. I won't say who it is, but they have embraced the Future Fit approach. And when they were, and this is a global company, and when their head of sustainability was going round to the various countries talking to employees about this, some of the employees were bursting into tears. They were so happy that the company was finding its purpose. And you can't buy that kind of commitment and that emotional attachment to what the business is doing. So I think we don't necessarily have to invent crazy new ways of doing things, because people make their own meaning, and they want to be part of something bigger and something meaningful. All we need to do is give them the space to do that.
Do we need another kind of organization of governance in organizations, like holacracy, sociocracy, ways of management, of manage the government in an organization? Because you have the compliance, you have compliance tools, but it's not enough. It's not enough to.
Well, I think what we've tried to do.
Norms.
Yeah, what we've tried to do with the benchmark is define where everyone needs to be. So it's the kind of what do you need, where do you need to get to. We haven't said how you do that, right? So what I would say is, in theory, a very hierarchical business could become future fit. But the reality is that the more an organization empowers people to be self-organized, to innovate on their own, to fail in a safe way,
and to learn continuously,
right, the more it is likely to become future fit. So think of it like this. If you go to your doctor to see whether you're physically fit, he will do things like measure your blood pressure, measure your pulse rate, and so forth, blood sugar, all these things. That, if you are a healthy person, those metrics will be within certain parameters. Okay? And that will tell him that you are probably leading a healthy life, right? What it doesn't do is tell him whether you're exercising 5 times a week, whether you're eating the right food, and so on and so forth. So there's a difference between where it is we need to get. Bless you.
Thank you.
The metrics, the future fit metrics, and the goals really are measure the symptoms of behaving in a completely different way. Right? You get to become future fit by reorganizing your business, by rethinking your products, by rethinking how you manage waste, by rethinking how you engage suppliers, and so on. And we're not trying to answer that how question. Our sense is that it's much better to give companies a clear destination to aim for, and then allow them to innovate towards it. Because you don't get very far if you tell companies how to do stuff.
Yeah. Right? And there are another theories that talk about the flourishing economy. Like, for example, Chris Laszlo. I don't know if you know him, but he talks about autopoiesis applied to organizations. And do you feel it's in your work? Do you feel it is possible? It is.
Well, I think it's thinking of an organization like that, reinventing organizations in that way. And there are things, there's other organizations, there's a thrivability initiative, there's conscious capitalism type approaches. And all of those things can be useful ways to rethink the way your organization operates. So that's about, how do you become an organization that is up to the task of becoming future fit. Right? How do you, if you want to run a marathon, right, what is it you need to do as a person to be able to achieve that? Right? Well, you need to eat healthily, you need to train a lot, and so forth. Well, if you're an organization who wants to pursue future fitness, what is it you need to do to that organization? And those other tools can be very good ways of thinking about how to reorganize internally around that. And B Corp is a good example, right? So the whole B Corp idea and what the B Corp impact assessment measures, it's not just focused on the end goal. It's like, how do you structure things internally? What is, how is your governance set up? How is your leadership defined? How do you work with your communities and so forth? So the way to think of it is that the journey to a sustainable future is long, complicated, and often unknown. You don't know what terrain you're going to encounter on the journey. So you need two things. You need a vehicle that is up to the journey, that can negotiate whatever terrain you come across, and you need a clear destination to aim for. So B Corp and other things, other initiatives that talk about how to reorganize an organization, that's like your vehicle. Right? That's making sure your vehicle is fit for the journey. Future Fit is just like the GPS. It tells you where to go and how to steer towards.
Like a compass. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And what do you think about systemic innovation? You know this the term systemic innovation.
Not sure. Explain.
It's a way of innovating, thinking about the system and all the interconnectedness of the system.
Okay.
And this is very very new in there are not much many places where it's being applied, but here some organizations are trying to do that. In Buenos Aires, we have a PhD in systemic innovation.
Oh, great!
It's yes, it's led by Alexander Laszlo.
Okay.
And well, do you think it's interesting to incorporate this in your?
Well, so I think that everything we need to do needs to be set within the system context of the natural processes of the planet and the resilience of our social fabric. And this is why I like the natural step work so much, because it sets out the system conditions within which society would have to operate to ensure that we are in no way undermining our transition to a sustainable future. Okay. So I think a lot of companies have used the natural step framework as a way to steer their innovation. Good example of how it can help. CFCs, a couple of decades ago, became a huge problem because they were escaping, they were used as a refrigerant, they were escaping from fridges when they were destroyed and going up into the atmosphere. And then they were not, they had such a long half-life, they were staying in the atmosphere for a long time. Now, if people had used the natural step framework when they were considering which chemicals to use as a refrigerant, they would never have used CFCs in the first place, because the natural step system conditions say that we must not contribute to a systemic buildup of substances created by society in the environment. We can use whatever substances we want as long as they do not systematically build up in the environment. Now, we knew before we started using them that CFCs had a really long half-life. So if we had thought about the fact that refrigerants are going to escape into the atmosphere and the number of refrigerators out there is huge and growing, we would have realized actually we cannot use that as a refrigerant. It is going to cause problems. So we could and should have seen that problem coming. Another example more recently is these microbeads, plastic microbeads in everything from shampoo to toothpaste. It's insane that we are putting plastic particles into products which are designed to end up in waste streams. They go down the sink, right, into wastewater. There was a study published the other day where they're saying that the average plate of oysters, if you order a plate of oysters in a restaurant, average plate of oysters has about 50 microscopic particles of plastic in it.
Oh,
unbelievable. So if you were to start with the natural step system conditions, you would never have put plastic particles into products that are designed to end up in waste streams, because you're contributing to this accumulation of human-made substances in the environment. So companies that are innovating using this framework, they rule out options like that very quickly. So companies like Interface, a carpet company, which is always cited as a real leader in sustainability, they've been using the natural step system conditions for many years to drive their product innovation. And as a result, they've ended up with some fantastic, they make carpet tiles, they've ended up with fantastic carpet tiles, which they can buy back at the end of their life. They can separate the fibers from the backing and reuse all aspects of that material to create their next product. And they've done that because they've thought from day one how to design it according to these system innovation principles.
Very interesting. There are some ISO quality like certified, but there is not a certified and a sustainability certified around the world. You have, for example, ISO 14001. We have the ISO. There are a
9001. Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
Do you think we need a new certification? What do we need? Because we have B Corps that are a kind of certification because they have a lot of key KPIs, but so the ISO companies, the companies that are working with ISOs certifying here or in another countries like Bureau Veritas are I don't know if they are embedded of sustainability in sustainability mindset. There is a problem with who controls the companies that certify that an ISO is being accomplished.
Well, I think the ISO certifications are very helpful, but they're nowhere near enough. You can easily they're about the kind of processes and systems you have in place. So in that sense, they're kind of like the GRI is for reporting, sustainability reporting. You can produce a report that adheres to all of the GRI guidelines.
Yeah.
Right? And you can do that in a very systematic way, but the actual performance of your organization might be terrible.
Yeah,
it's just that you're reporting it in a very good way.
Right? Yeah.
It's the same with the ISO standards. You can have an exceptionally good environmental management system that tracks all of your waste, for example.
Yeah.
But you might be generating huge amounts of waste.
Yeah.
So there's only so much that those certification standards can do, and at the moment they're focused on the processes rather than ultimately where we need to get to.
Yeah.
Maybe at some point we will have some kind of future fit certification equivalent. Who knows? For now, we want to make this as useful as possible to companies and to investors as well.
Yeah, because in my activity teaching sustainability, they always ask me, is there a certification, a certificate? No, there is not. There is not. We have many ISO that are being like, or SA 8000, but
it's like so in the UK, I'm sure it's the same here. We have a safety test for cars. So after a car is 3 years old, every year it has to have a test to check that it's still safe to be on the road.
Do you think that one of the of the solutions would come from the industry, from, for example, the automotive industry, or do you think that?
No, I don't, because maybe it's cynical, but I think if you leave it to companies within a sector to define what they should all do, you end up with something that they think they can achieve, not something they should achieve. So, I heard one head of sustainability for a car company recently say that in the next 30 years, there will be another billion cars on the road. Well, that's crazy. That's forecasting how many more cars we will sell based on what they want to sell.
Yeah.
Right? So we've got to, instead of forecasting, we need to use the natural step approach of backcasting. Where do we want to be?
Yeah.
And then how do we work backwards to figure out what needs to happen? Let's not start by saying there will be another billion cars on the road. How will we deal with this problem? That's just nuts. That's insane.
Yeah.
That doesn't solve anything. We're reconciling ourselves to having roads that are impossible to drive on because there's so much traffic, and then saying, how are we going to fix this when we get to that point?
Yeah.
What we need to think about is, how are we going to move people around when there are 9 billion people on the planet? How can we make sure everyone has access to mobility services? That might not involve cars at all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just one example, that if you leave it up to existing sectors, they think within that sector. They're not thinking of their contribution to the overall system as a whole. That's why I think you need a clear line in the sand. Every company's got to reach, no matter what its size or sector. some sectors, some companies in some sectors will never become future fit unless they completely change their business model.
Yeah.
It just can't happen. But that's how it should be, because their current business models are fundamentally unsustainable.
Yeah.
Fossil fuels is a perfect example.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Automotive companies. If you're one of our goals is products do not emit greenhouse gases. If you're a car company making cars with internal combustion engines powered by petrol or diesel, every product you sell is emitting greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm.
If you're Tesla and the only cars you make are electric, you're not forcing your customer to emit greenhouse gases. Now, the customer could use electricity that has been generated from fossil fuels, but you're not forcing them to do that. If you're building a car with a petrol engine, they can't even drive down the block without emitting greenhouse gases.
Mm-hmm.
So some car companies will say it's impossible. Our products emit greenhouse gases. We can't avoid that. Well,
Mm-hmm.
Tesla's already done that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a different way of thinking about these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, I think so. And finally, how do you think the new SDGs are going to be implemented? Because, for example, in countries like Argentina, we have difficulties to measure social issues.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to
It is
measure.
hard. It is hard.
And to incorporate it to...
Well, it's also, the SDGs are designed for countries and not for businesses. So it's very hard sometimes for companies to understand, well, what do they need to do to contribute to the SDGs? And there are 17 SDGs, and there's 169 targets. I think actually, although the SDGs are great as a destination for society as a whole, for business they're not very helpful. So the danger is that a company looks at these 169 targets, finds maybe 4 or 5 that it thinks, oh yeah, we have a good story on that one, and then they talk about that stuff and say that's our contribution to SDGs without actually changing it.
Yeah.
That's the danger.
Yeah.
With Future Fit, what we've done, and this will be published on our website in about a week's time, we've mapped all of the Future Fit goals to the SDGs. So we're saying that a company that is becoming Future Fit can legitimately say, here is the contribution it's making to each of these SDGs. And a company who's not trying to become Future Fit is actually undermining progress toward those SDGs.
Uh-huh.
So it's not about just choosing the ones you want to talk about.
Yeah.
This is about taking an overall view and understanding where you're helping progress and where you're hindering progress.
Yeah. And you're based in London.
We are.
London is one of the countries that has more problems of women leadership, and Objective 5 is one of the goals of sustainability in the new SDGs. Do you work with Future Fit in that issue?
Well, so we have a goal around discrimination.
Yeah, or equal.
Yeah, and fair employment terms and so on.
Or women leadership, for example, because
so we don't. We're very careful not to say things like there should be 50% women in every job, because there are just many jobs that doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't work like that. So, for example, if you're in a mining sector, you may get far fewer women. Yeah. Particularly in the mines, whereas if you're in, for example, junior school education, you may get much higher percentage of women. Yeah. It would be crazy to try and force equality. It doesn't work like that. Of course. What you need is equality of opportunity.
Yes.
So that's what we try and capture.
You have KPIs.
Yeah,
that,
and we
have a problem in Argentina with that because we don't have KPIs.
Yeah.
And the United Nations indeed are asking for cases of. Yeah.
It gets very difficult to measure this stuff. And we released our first full version in May with a first full set of indicators. But we know that they're not perfect yet. So we're working with a group of companies at the moment. We have what we call our development council. And at the moment we have the Body Shop, Novo Nordisk, big healthcare company, and Avery Dennison, big labeling company, B2B business. And we're working with them to improve the metrics as we go. So the goals will stay the same. We're not moving the line in the sand. but the way we can measure progress toward them will get better over time.
Okay, Geoff, it
Okay.
was very nice to meet you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And have a good stay in Argentina.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.